this is something that, in like a really short, quick, easy understanding, is that something you have to evolve past. It's something that's ingrained for a very long time. Or I shouldn't say long time, evolutionarily. It's been ingrained since the beginning of, when the earth started having less plant mass. But I'm not trying to get into evolutionary history on this one, so I'm not trying to explain exactly where it comes from and why that evolutionary adaptation became a thing. I'm more or less addressing the end result. So when somebody says that, and this is like the reason why it's so relevant to spiritual matters, is that people will say this, and I've heard famous people say this. I've heard all sorts of types say effectively similar things. You can say it underlies all sorts of schools of thought from all sorts of other angles, but this underlying thing of scarcity mentality or scarcity mindset and what it actually entails. And I know it's a lot of lead up, but if you don't realize what it is, I have to explain it in a way of showing the observer what we are actually talking about. Because this is such an ingrained concept that there's just no, getting someone to actually observe and see it and understand that this is happening is actually quite difficult, because it is so baked into the cake. From storytelling to, like I said, other schools of thought, concepts of how things should run, it's everywhere. So to get to the matter, what I'm going to say here, a scarcity mindset. And this explanation, I know I'm being kind of jumbled with it, but people will say this, that life only has value because it is scarce. And another way of saying this is that death gives life meaning. That if you don't die, life has no meaning because then life wouldn't be scarce. This is how people view it. Now, me personally, I see this sometimes as a cope, a way of saying, well, if I can't beat this, I'm going to justify it. Saying well, if I can't beat death, I'm going to just sit there and say, well, death is a good thing. Rather than then if death is a good thing, you should immediately do it. It's this idea of saying oh wow, life and death are these synonymous things or whatever. And I have to break that down and show that it's not. Life and death are not opposites. Life and death are quite separate. And as I'll say, death is a separate realm from life. The realm of death is not the realm of life. And they don't intersect. And they're not polar opposites or anything. They're unrelated. And that is a very hard thing for people to get, because they're so used to thinking death is the opposite of life. And, and I'll kind of explain it like this. If you were to say that death is the opposite of life, then you have to kind of define what life is. And if you define life in a way of oh, you're living, you're doing things or whatnot, then every moment you're not living, are you dead? When you go to sleep, do you quasi-die? What if you were put in an ice cube and you weren't moving? Are you then dead? And then when you're risen from the ice cube, are you now alive again? Were you alive the whole time? If a computer shuts off, it's off. And then when you turn a computer on, it's on, But that doesn't change what's stored on the computer in of itself. It's no, I'm not gonna get into you have stuff like RAM where it only stores what it has voltage on. But what we're seeing here is that what's stored on the computer on its its hard disk space does not change when you turn the computer off or on. So if you have a human and you quote unquote could turn them off and on, one moment they're dead, now the next moment they're alive, and now the next moment they're dead, now the next moment they're alive. You would sit there and be that doesn't make sense. Death is a permanent transition. Life is, some people say, a temporary transition, but that's why these concepts aren't really related. They don't make sense with one another. I know, when you think about, if every second you're technically dead until you do something to prove that you're alive, and if you're not constantly, doing something to show that you're alive, you're just dead in those moments, that's a bad way of looking at it. However, if you believe life is the opposite of death, and, death is the opposite of life, that would actually be the logical conclusion, that every single moment you're not doing something, you're dead, because life isn't happening. And then as soon as life is happening, you're not alive and no longer dead. And thus you have to be doing something to be alive. That life itself has to be, in motion or whatever. And that's, I'm saying, not a good way of looking at it. And another way of like kind of like showing that death and life are not even similar at all is ask yourself the question, is a rock dead? And the thing is about this, it's like if a rock is dead, which you could say it definitely is dead, it's not alive, so therefore a rock is dead. It's like, well, no, it had to be living once for it to be dead. And then you have to ask the question, what is living? What if, something consumed that rock? And now that rock eventually became a part of somebody's like bones or whatever. Then eventually it was ground down, and now it became back into limestone or whatever again. Was the rock alive or dead? And this idea of transitioning between life and death isn't really a transition. These are like concepts. I'm not trying to say that things don't die. But what I'm trying to say is like they're not a pair or coupling, as in showing you that life does not give death meaning and death does not give life meaning. They are separate. They are different realms, different states. When something is dead, something is not alive. And that's kind of like a weird way of saying it. Is there a difference between death and not alive? And like I said, like, what do you consider life? What do you consider evolution? What do you consider any of these things? And you can go back and say, well, at one point, the universe was just, hydrogen atoms. And as chemistry evolved, as matter evolved, eventually complex, or eventually derived more complex matters, as they're gestations in stars and so forth. That evolution of matter, do you consider that life? When do you consider it life? And this thing is like, life in of itself is like when we say an opposite to life, or an opposite to death. These are concepts that don't really make sense when you, like I say, understand them as they are not pairs. If I said, like I said, if I reverse death on a rock, does it become a bird? Does it become a different type of rock? Does it become a beetle? What does it become when I reverse death on a rock? But then you say, well, there's things that are not alive. But once again, you can consume that rock, and now that rock becomes a part of you. Like say, like you consume calcium, for example, it becomes a part of your bones. Are your bones alive? And that understanding of life is like, you look at it like an intracellular matrix. It's not necessarily cells. Like say, that's the stuff between cells and whatnot. An extracellular matrix of bone, for example. You have little cells that are in between that, shoot it out and break it down and, shape your bones. But the bone itself is effectively a rock. It's not really what you want to think about, but it's effectively a rock that's produced by cells squirting out, chemicals to make, a cool rock. Think of it like human cement. And, crazy concept there, but the point being is that, like, when we talk about what is life, and this understanding of life being this, like, concept that's supposed to be paired off with death, it doesn't make sense, because your bone is not alive. If you look at it that way, it's not alive, but you don't think about what life really is. And that's the thing about this definition, is that we're trying to figure out what life actually is. And, I'm not trying to define that here, but I'm trying to show that the understanding that is given, that death is the opposite of life. And the reason why this definition is given is that it's a way to give death meaning. In other words, then rather than say that death has no meaning, that death is meaningless, which makes more sense. We want to give death meaning because it's inevitable. At least that's what is said to people. Now that's because, if I get into concepts of heaven, other existences within yourself, expansions of the universe and everything else, and different forms of existence that, quote unquote, conquer death. The thing is, like, this doesn't work for certain individuals. And thus, the idea that, I can give my death meaning by pairing it off with life, using that school duality, using life to give death meaning, and then saying death gives life meaning. No, it doesn't. And like another explanation of this is because, once again, to the scarcity mentality, which is what this is kind of showing here, is that if you have unlimited life, by that definition of a scarcity mentality, life is worthless then. Because unless you die, your life is meaningless. And that's the danger of a scarcity mentality. It pairs this thing in this way, in a very dangerous concept. To give death meaning, you basically eliminate life's meaning. And technically this is like a law of equivalent exchange stuff, so I'm not saying this is technically a matter of magic and sorcery. However, when it comes to this transmutation that is performed to give death meaning, you destroy life's meaning in that process. So if someone's have infinite life, you destroy its meaning because it has to be tied to death. And to give us another explanation of showing like this is the scarcity mindset. Imagine you have like a person who's a woodworker, and you sat there and told them that, or they had the situation where they have unlimited amounts of wood to work with. That woodworker would not say the wood is valueless. It's quite almost, not the case at all. And rather than seeing it as a valuable thing because it's scarce, they could see it as, I can make as much stuff as I want now. I can endlessly create. Who knows what wonders can appear? What buildings, toys, artwork, other objects for other uses, such as like chairs and tables, tools. Now, I don't think people like to think of a chair as a tool, but effectively is, has a form and function. The form, function, tools effectively. But the point being is like a woodworker would not necessarily see an infinite amount of wood as, oh, wood is valueless now because I have unlimited amounts of wood. I don't need this anymore. No, the woodworker, because of what they do, would see the value in that wood still. In other words, like, you don't see the wood as valueless because you have an abundance of wood. You now see it as, and this is like kind of the thing of when we go to creating abundances, and this is like why a scarcity mindset is so dangerous, even on a civilizational level. Because imagine if you create abundance. You have infinite wood, infinite energy, all of this abundance, or effectively infinite. Once again, that's a whole other concept that people don't like to talk about, is effectively infinite. If you have a gajillion wood and you can never use it in your whole lifetime, is it effectively infinite to you? You could never consume it all. And you might as well say you have unlimited wood, because you can never use it all. And that's effectively a lot of situations. So imagine you create such a situation. Well, if you have a scarcity mindset, you would hate that situation. You would want to go back in time when wood was scarce. Therefore, when wood was valuable to you, because you only see the value in the scarcity. And that is why when you, certain people and things will have, like, say, this scarcity mindset, and you'll see it like, well, energy's only valuable if it's scarce. So when it comes like, like economic stuff or whatever, one of the best ways to effectively make profits with these types of people is to create an artificial scarcity, also while not trying to destroy demand for it. So, for example, this is just, as an idea, let's say you have like some energy source, and you're like, well, the more I produce of it, these people will see less of a cost for it. Now it's like, oh, they won't pay me as much. So wait a minute, maybe producing more energy isn't a good idea. Maybe if I want to make more money, I control the supply of said energy source and, and keep it at a certain level to keep it at a certain price. Rather than trying to increase the demand for energy, I'll just reduce the supply and thus still, make tons and tons of money. And like I say, that's with a scarcity mindset. Now, if you have an abundance mindset, you have people say, wait a minute, we don't want this thing to be like something we're having to pay tons of money for. We want to produce an abundance because we want to use it to do work. For example, imagine if you had an abundance of energy and now you can explore and do other economic activities. Let's say, you can now make new video games or whatever because energy is cheaper, so you can like run larger scale whatevers. And that type of abundance is not profitable because if you're the energy person, you want to sell that energy for a profit, and thus you will want to regress back to when energy wasn't abundant. Same thing with life. You want to regress life to when life was scarce if you're, a dealer in life or other lively things. So in other words, controlling the supply. It's just like, even though it's like, let's say this is a spiritual matter, you can see how it affects the, world that you live in real ways. You see it all the time. Rather than like, control like the productions. I mean, trying to be like, produce a ton of it. It's better to produce very little and make sure no one else produces it. And thus having basically cornered the market by, controlling the supply. More important for the profits, especially in something that is necessary for something else. And thus, producing abundance for these people is against them. They don't want to produce abundance. So, as I was saying with death and life type stuff, those people who push the idea that death gives life meaning do not want to press or do things that would extend life, because they want life to be finite. And that is the scarcity mindset.